Hi everyone, my name is Zach and welcome to the final video of this advanced sculpting exercise. In this video I will show you how to add these bells, some smaller details like some buttons and rings here and there, and also we will replace the bad looking eyes with some nicer looking eyes, and we will finalize the whole creature by scaling this into the right size in terms of metric units, and at the end we will have our final sculpting. Cool, huh? Alright, without further words, let's get started. For this we will add a new object, a plane in this case. Let's start with this simple thing. In this case I use a mirror modifier, so we have this thing here on both sides. So let's add a mirror modifier. Move this somewhere close to the area where we want to use this. Then we enable snapping. So if I move this around, it will snap to the surface underneath it. These buttons back here should also be enabled if this should work properly. Now let's add the solidify modifier and subsurf modifier. And if this is too roundish, you also can add a bevel modifier before the subsurf modifier. And make this a little bit smaller and not that thick. And the higher you put the subsurf modifier, the better the resolution is. So now we can move this down here. And maybe we disable snapping for a short while, then we can move this in here a bit. So in this trick we can create this one here. So then we have the things going from here over to the other side, same thing as here. Basically starting from this claw thing here. Let's duplicate this one here with Shift D and move it down here. And here we can use the other trick to get a better result. Let's just delete a few vertices so that we only have 4 left. And now let's add a shrink wrap modifier here as well, a shrink wrap modifier. Let's move it up after the mirror modifier and let's take the body here as target object. That means if I now move something around, it will automatically be displayed on the background. And if we add another subsurf modifier before this shrink wrap modifier, set this to simple, increase the resolution, set the bevel to angle, make the thickness of the solidify modifier a bit smaller, and then you can see that we just can move this over the surface and it will automatically attach this to the surface. So if this is too close to the body, you can enable keep offset and increase the offset. Then you can see it will hover a little bit over the body. So and in this case I would disable the mirror modifier so that we have a more natural flow here, and then it also does not look the same on both sides. So the end here should not be attached to the character here. So let's select this two here, go to Object Data, Vertex Group, add a new group, hit Assign with the selected vertices. And then we can choose this vertex group for the shrink wrap modifier. And now let's invert this. Usually if you put it in here, only this vertices will be projected on the surface. But if we invert this, then this will be excluded. And as you can see now I can move them around freely so that we can move them up here. The same thing I do for the other side. So let's copy this thing here, Shift D. Let's hide the sacs, or the one sac. Enable snapping, and let's create the second one here. Let's add the last one also to this group here by selecting this and then hitting Assign. Disable snapping, and then we can move this up. So let's make it a bit thicker again to make it more prominent, something like this. So now the similar thing we use up here for the head, and then we have to add a free belt hanging down here. So let's choose the same object, go to edit mode, select 4 vertices, Shift D, move them up here, use snapping and projection on the surface here. So here we have to take care because we also have the scales. So let's see if this is working. Also, let's add a clipping border here. And maybe up here we should do it without the shrink wrap. So select all this and assigning this to the vertex group. And now this is excluded. And also we should add a few more loop cuts. So here we will add this ring, and from there we have 2 smaller ones going down here. So here you can see something is wrong. Basically the thickness is now pointing in the other direction. That means we have to flip the normals, select all that, press Ctrl Shift N to flip the normals. Let's also change the subsurf up here to cut more Clark so it appears smoother. And then we can just add some loop cuts here to make it sharper on the edge. Press Alt B to remove the clipping border. Now we have this shape up there. So now let's quickly add the rings here. So for this I place the 3D cursor here, press Shift A and add a torus. Let's reduce the segments to 24 and the other segments to 8. And let's change the radius. Something like this. Here we can add a subsurf modifier for a higher resolution, and then let's move it down here. Duplicate this to the other side. And then let's adjust this stuff here so it's better fitting with the ring here. And what we also can do is to create this shape around this ring. So I move this down, extrude this a few times. So I try to make it pretty quick for the tutorial here, so it might be not perfect in any sense. But I think you get the idea, and you see that this looks much more interesting than if you just connect it directly with these rings here. So maybe let's add another loop cut here. So, and now let's add the final part, this long straps here. So let's keep in this mesh here, so I duplicate one of these things here. First of all, it's important that it is moving straight down and then it's bending. But as you can see, not too much. We have to add enough loop cuts here. So now I realize that I did something wrong here, because this end, which is going over this here, should be attached to the other side. So let's press V to separate this. And let's just move it over here. And here let's try one thing. Let's select this edge here, Ctrl+ to increase the selection. And then I duplicate this by pressing Shift D. So I don't need to rebuild the whole thing again. And then let's connect this stuff here by pressing F. And here the normal is wrong, so press Ctrl N or Ctrl Shift N to flip this. If this is not working, let's select this whole thing, Ctrl N or Ctrl Shift N in this case. Then everything is aligning perfectly. So then we can go with this one over to this side here. Then let's reconnect this new thing here with this one here. And now it's going over the whole body here. Let's unhide the sack here. And now we have all the important stuff. And as final thing, let's select the wing here. Press Shift D and move it over here. And let's duplicate this to the other side, because here we can't really see it, so we don't need to add this there. But over here certainly. Now we want to add some buttons, like here, or also in this area here, so that this looks a little bit more detailed. And here we will use a very simple trick. So let's place a 3D cursor here, Shift A and add a plane. In edit mode, let's rotate this 90 degrees and scale it down. So we have this very small plane. And now let's add some modifiers. First of all, the subdivision surface with 2 subdivisions. Now we have this round plane, as you can see. Now let's add a solidify modifier to add thickness. With the thickness value here we can define the thickness. And then let's add a bevel modifier. The limit method we set to angle so that not all edges will be beveled. Let's reduce the width. And then let's add a final subdivision surface modifier with 2 subdivisions. And now you can see with just one simple plane we created this button thing here. And if we want to put this on the surface of the other objects, we use the snapping tools down here. So we could enable the snapping, then it will be always on, but I don't do this because we also can hold down Control, then this will be enabled temporarily. Also, usually we enable this button here, but if I enable this and enable the snapping, you can see this is now snapping on the surface. But also this takes our view as projection direction, and then we get some weird stretching here. And because of that we disable this button down here, and then this other 2 buttons should be enabled. And if we're moving this now around, you can see there will be no stretching. But we have a little problem. The thickness now goes into the mesh. Certainly the thickness should go into the other direction, and because of that we set the offset value to +1. So and if I now press G, then hold down Control, I can move it around. And the good thing is, if you hold down Control and try to scale this, this does not work. And that's the nice thing. Now I can scale it, and afterwards I press G, Control, and place it somewhere here. Duplicate this. And now I can place this stuff easily on the surface here. Shift D, hold down Control. Let's enable smooth shading. And yeah, this easy we can add this little buttons here. If the thickness is not right, certainly you can always change the thickness to something you like. Yeah, and if this button is too simple for you, certainly you can also create some fancy looking button and then in object mode duplicate them and place them on the surface using the snapping options, the same way we used this for the scales. Alright, then for the belts let's also add a displacement modifier. And here let's use a detail clause texture and certainly reduce the strength. 0.003 looks fine for me. As you can see, up here we have a little bit more details and down here we have a little bit of stretching. But in this case I find this pretty okay. This looks nice and supports the shape somehow. This is caused by the low subdivision down here. As you can see, here we have this big faces and up here we have a lot of loop cuts. But anyway, we leave it as it is because this looks quite nice. So one last thing I want to do here with the shapes, and these are the eyes, because here I was pretty lazy, so let's adjust this pretty quick. I hit / on the numpad, then in edit mode I press P, separate by loose parts. That means all of the separated parts in edit mode will be separated as objects in object mode. Then let's select those two, set the origin to geometry, and now the center point is back in the center. The rotation is not that nice, but we don't care about this right now. Let's add a subdivision surface modifier with 2 subdivisions. And now let's quickly adjust this. So the rotation of this thing is pretty weird. That means if I want to change something here, it would be pretty hard to do right. And because of that, we can change the transform orientation to normal. Then it will use the normals of the selected faces. And as you can see right now, this is looking perfect. So now I can scale this, for example, by pressing S and Z 2 times. So first it will use the global axis and the second time it will use the normal axis in this case. So I scale this inwards basically. Something like this, move this in a bit, and then I have this nice eye shape already. I can add some additional loop cuts if I like. Adjust this. Then let's select the inner part here and extrude this inwards. Add some additional loop cuts here. And also I would delete this whole thing here. Delete faces, and then let's fill this again by pressing Ctrl F, grid fill. As you can see now this will be filled with only quads and then the shape is much nicer. Let's adjust the offset, basically the rotation of the new grid, and now this is looking pretty interesting. Let's check how it looks on the creature, and let's move this up a bit so that it's not intersecting with the surface. And what we also can do, if I press Ctrl+, I can increase the selection, and now with scaling in the Y direction I can scale this in this way that we have this more reptile eyes. And certainly if I like, I can rotate the whole thing, in this case in the Z direction, so that I have something like this. And in this way the eye looks a little bit more interesting than before. And now let's copy this shape over to the other eye. So I select this eye here, then with Shift this eye here, then I press Ctrl L, modifiers, and Ctrl L, object data. Now these two eyes using the same mesh information. Now we only have to rotate this one. Something like this. I mean, we don't see both eyes at the same time, so it doesn't have to be perfect. Yeah, and this easy we can add some nice looking eyes to the creature. And certainly these are not super realistic eyes if you want to create a production ready character, but for sculptings this is a nice eye shape because we can see the iris and the pupil pretty well. And this is nice if we just want to have this static figure with one clay shader on it, so it looks like a clay model or something like this. Okay, now let's finalize this. There's one little thing missing, and that's the resizing. Right now, this thing is pretty big, and also our reference human is pretty big. So if I select the armature, go to pose mode, and with Alt R, Alt G and Alt S, I can reset all the bones to the original position. And now we can see how big he is. He's about 3 meters and 10 centimeters. So these are basically Blender units, but if you switch this over under units to metric, for example, you can see these are also meters. So if we are using Blender units, one Blender unit is basically 1 meter. And I guess average human is about 1 meter and 80 high. So let's select everything here. And the skeleton is still active, as you can see. So we see the dimension of this one here. That means if I scale it so much down that I have 1 meter and 80, something around this. And according to this reference figure, now everything else was scaled, so everything should have a perfect scale now. But certainly in this way we also change the scale factor up here. That means we have to apply the scaling. This we can do by pressing Ctrl A. But you can see in this case we can't do it because two of the selected objects are using the same user data, and these are the eyes. So let's simply select the eyes, or one of them, and press U, make single user, object and data. Now we are unlinking these two objects from each other, and now this should work. If I hit Ctrl A and then scale. So the only thing now, after applying the scale, everywhere where we used the solidify modifier, for example, these things are now thicker, as you can see. Also over here, and also the buttons are thicker. And that means these modifiers we now have to adjust a bit. That means we go to the solidify modifier, and by holding down Shift I can slightly change these values so that it's looking fine again. Also the bevel modifier is changing a bit, so let's adjust this as well. And also the displacement might be a little bit stronger now, so we can reduce this also a bit. Yeah, and that's it basically. So to finalize this blend file, I just renamed all the objects here. I put all the luggage, saddle, bells, rope stuff on one layer and all the creature stuff on one layer. And then we still have the floor down here. Now we have to adjust this a bit because we scaled the creature. Let's check where our grid floor is. So let's move this up to 0, and let's also move the whole creature thing up. And as you can see, since we've posed the creature, one leg is hovering a bit above the ground, but this is perfectly fine because it's just like he's starting to walk or something like this. But the second foot is a little bit wrong rotated, as you can see. So let's just rotate the whole creature a bit. So I place a 3D cursor here. Switch the pivot point to 3D cursor, and now if I rotate this along the x-axis, you can see I can rotate this and maybe move this up a bit so that this deformation here is fitting to the ground. Yeah, and in this way we can adjust this a bit. So then we just have one problem. All the things that are hanging down are not aligning perfectly. But yeah, this is not a problem at all. Let's quickly adjust this. Okay, in this way everything looks fine again. So, and just for this very final part of this video, so now let's quickly enable the multi-res of the creature and also for the scales. And also for this claw thing here. And yeah guys, we are done. As you can see, this is our final sculpting. Yeehaw! Alright, that's it. We're done. Yeah guys, that's it with this large exercise. I hope you've learned a lot doing this sculpting. And keep in mind, all the tricks we have learned here, you can use them for other things as well. For other projects, for other sculptings, even if you want to sculpt something completely different than a creature. Also, if you now want to add some quick procedural shading to your creature, take a look into the next chapter.